What's the difference between a myth and a legend? For most of us, it's just semantics. We hear the word myth and think of made-up stories about gods and monsters. But for scientists, historians, and archaeologists, a myth is something completely different. It could be the key to solving one of history's greatest mysteries. Now you know what we're talking about. Let's get started. Myths are born from legends, which are stories that may or may not be rooted in reality. The details change depending on who's telling the story. And with each retelling, more embellishments are added until it becomes something outlandish and unbelievable. Take the Great Flood, for example. In the Bible, Noah and his family escape the rising waters and survive in an enormous boat. Other cultures have similar flood myths. There are similarities between the biblical account and the story of the great Mesopotamian king Gilgamesh. But there are also differences. But how much of this story is real? Nobody knows for sure, but researchers believe it was inspired by a catastrophic flood that happened thousands of years ago. The Black Sea and the Dead Sea were once home to a thriving civilization of people who lived there between 7,500 and 6,000 BC. But then water levels rose, turning these inland lakes into an inland sea. The population had to flee, but not before their cities were underwater. No written records survived. So everything we know comes from archaeological evidence and material remains. That's when legends are born. Someone survives the cataclysmic flood and tells the story to others. Over time, the story changes. Details are lost and others are added. Soon, you have a myth. But let's look at another myth, this time from Greece. The Minotaur was a creature with the head of a bull and the body of a man. It lived deep within the labyrinth, a giant maze where it was fed human sacrifices. Theseus, a hero from Athens, slew the beast and rescued King Menes' daughter, Ariadne. This myth seems outlandish, but it could be inspired by a horrifying event in Minoan history. Around 1600 BC, the Minoans built a huge palace called Knossos. They ruled over the island of Crete. Their empire was huge, extending all the way to the Egyptian coast. But around 1450 BC, a series of earthquakes devastated the region. Survivors retreated to safer parts of the island. Any records from before the disaster were destroyed, leaving us with no way of knowing how many people died. Archaeologists estimate that the death toll reached into the thousands. Those who lived huddled in caves away from the palace. Some may have even taken shelter in a network of tunnels underneath the palace. The Minoans built their new society on top of the ruins. Generations passed and the tunnels were forgotten. Then one day someone stumbled across them. Rumors spread that the tunnels were actually a labyrinth hiding all sorts of scary monsters. The myth of the Minotaur was born. But how can we tell if myths are based on fact? Let's look at this question through a few different lenses. What do scientists say? Scientists aren't sure if any myths are truly based on fact. There are three main reasons why. First, most myths come from oral tradition. People would sit around telling stories. This means details changed from one retelling to the next. Second, science is empirical. To prove something happened, we need physical evidence. But most myths have no connection to anything physical. Finally, our limited understanding of the ancient world makes it hard to separate fact from fiction. But what do historians say? Historians approach this question in a slightly different way. Many believe that every myth has a grain of truth buried somewhere inside. Even if the majority of the story isn't true, there's always something that happened to inspire it in the first place. But where do these inspirations lie? Some myths were created to explain natural disasters, like hurricanes, droughts, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and tsunamis. These were all major threats to life in the ancient world. Floods are common in Mesopotamia. For centuries, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers overflowed, destroying entire villages. This inspired the story of the Great Flood. Droughts were also a big problem. Crops failed and livestock died. The Canaanites blamed this on El, their god of the sun and rain. When he grew angry, there would be no rain for months. Their myth explained why sometimes their crops would fail. But sometimes a historic person inspires a myth. Most heroes and gods were based on real people, but they were often given superhuman qualities. Gilgamesh, the subject of the Epic of Gilgamesh, was the king of Uruk in Mesopotamia. He ruled there between 2100 and 2050 BC, according to legend. He fought a terrifying monster named Humbaba. He also searched for the secret to immortality. But was Gilgamesh really immortal? Some scholars say the story was inspired by multiple kings who ruled over Urk in succession. If so, they were conflated into one legendary hero. Ancient Greeks also identified constellations based on famous people, like Orion the Hunter and the twins, which represent Castor and Pollux. One Greek hero was Theseus, the man who slayed the Minotaur. This myth could be based on a real event. Between 3,500 and 2000 BC, humans domesticated bulls. First, they were kept for religious purposes, but eventually farmers used them for work and food. Bulls were revered throughout the ancient Mediterranean. Their horns symbolized strength and power. To the ancient Greeks, the bull was sacred. It represented the god Zeus, but it could also be dangerous. Imagine being an ordinary man who enters the arena to sacrifice a bull. Suddenly it charges. You run for your life, but it's too late. You're gored and killed. Maybe the Minotaur wasn't a man-eating monster, but a vicious bull. The labyrinth could have been a fenced enclosure used for animal fighting. One type of myth involves taking something real and making it bigger, like the Loch Ness Monster or Bigfoot. Many cultures have stories about scary animals that live in remote areas. Sometimes these stories seem ridiculous, but other times there could be something to them. Take the unicorn, for example. Its magical horse had a single horn growing out of its forehead. Unicorns supposedly possessed healing powers. Could they be real? The answer is yes, kind of. Researchers believe the ancient Greeks saw narwhals swimming in the ocean. They described a horse-like creature with a single horn. Greeks called it a monoceros. This inspired the unicorn myth. The Greeks also thought they saw mammoths and described them as wild men covered in hairy skin. They called them cynocephali. The Chinese had a similar myth. They told stories about a qilin, a majestic deer-like creature with a single horn on its forehead. Could it be based on the same thing? Maybe. Sometimes myths are created when people misinterpret things they find. In the Middle Ages, European explorers discovered bones in South America that they didn't recognize. They thought they were the bones of giants because they were so big. Later, scientists realized that they were actually prehistoric reptiles. Ancient Chinese explorers found dinosaur eggs and believed they were laid by dragons. Someone finds a fossil and mistakes it for a dragon's egg. This kicks off a myth that's passed down for generations. The ancient Greeks explored the island of Crete in the Aegean Sea. This is where they found something strange. A huge wall surrounded the island, but nobody knew where it came from. It looked ancient, but it was so well built that historians couldn't imagine who could have built it. They invented a myth about a giant called the Troas. He roamed the island building walls, but he was cursed to become an animal after killing someone accidentally. Eventually, he fled to Asia Minor, where he settled down and became a hero known as Hector. This explains why the Trojans were such fierce fighters. They descended from a giant cursed by magic. Was it real? No. Today, historians know it was built between 1800 and 1300 BC. But the Greeks were right about one thing. It wasn't built by giants. The civilization that built it had long since vanished, leaving us with nothing but the ruins and our imaginations. In Greek literature, the city of Troy was considered a myth. Its existence was questioned for centuries. But today, archaeologists have uncovered evidence proving that it really existed. Troy was located near the Dardanelles Strait, an important trade route between the Aegean and Black Seas. The kingdom of Troy controlled this area. As a result, they grew very rich. Around 1200 BC, the city was destroyed by an earthquake. This was the Trojan War, and it inspired Homer to write the Iliad and the Odyssey. But Troy was never a myth. The only myth was that it was a great metropolis. It was actually a collection of small settlements, a village. This calls into question other legendary places, like the land of Atlantis. Plato wrote about this advanced civilization, but it's widely accepted that it didn't exist. What if we've got it wrong? What if some civilizations were simply wiped out by natural disasters and history forgot about them? There could be entire cities hiding beneath the ground waiting for us to discover them.